and we knew how to work it out to get economic growth. The Club of Rome struck a discordant note in 1972 by saying, no, we think the pace of change is going to continue to accelerate, and we are continuing to use resources at a greater and greater rate, and the 2040s will be a particularly dangerous period. If you look at the projections that were being made and the very crude sort of computers that we had at that time. Nobody really wanted to hear that, although the book sold well. It's the biggest selling environment book in world history. But it was a message that the political figures of the day didn't want to hear. They were locked in that sort of paradigm of economic growth. They were unwilling to think about the unthinkable. It's interesting to note that around the time of the Club of Rome, in its report, we get in the United States Dr. Marion King Huppert making comments about what is called peak oil. Dr. King worked for Shell, the oil company, and was a super talented person, but somewhat abrasive. He knew he was super bright and kept telling you that he was, so he wouldn't tolerate idiots. Dr. King calculated how much oil there is in an oil well. And he argued that looking at the way in which we are consuming oil, the Americans would start to run out of oil in 1970, and the globe itself would run out around the year 2000. And this is what's called the peak oil debate. So the argument is, therefore, that we're consuming the resources. Now, it reaches a peak, after which it becomes harder and harder to get at the oil. And Dr. King came up with a formula which would predict when that peak would be. Now, he wasn't saying that we will completely run out of oil. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. But he was saying that the stuff that's easily available will start to run out. In the United States in 1970, he got that right. And in the year 2000, well, he may have got that wrong, but only by a few years. An oil company for which I was doing some work in Vietnam a couple of years ago talked about drilling now through the Gulf of Mexico, very much in the news because BP is there. This was Chevron. Chevron is now working on a project to drill down 5 miles to look for oil, right at the very bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, deeper than BP has been willing to go. That's the engineering equivalent of installing a lift inside Mount Everest, which goes up for 5 miles. So in other words, we are going to deeper depths, more and more costly, more and more dangerous, as we've seen in the last few weeks in the Gulf of Mexico with the BP tragedy. So in other words then, that we may well now have reached peak oil, which is what the late Dr. King predicted, globally speaking, that we have reached that point. Population, though down from the high birth rate of the 1960s, is still increasing. It's a bit like a big ship entering Sydney Harbour. It turns off its engines well out to sea, and it then cruises in under its own momentum. And the same thing will happen with population. In other words, yes, we're managing to slow down the global population growth, but nonetheless it will move along under its own momentum for several decades to come. As the society gets richer, so it consumes more resources, and the Club of Rome's original calculations did not factor in the growth of China and India. Both were seen in those days as very poor developing countries. So economic development also brings increased pollution. It's interesting to note that of the 20 most polluted cities in the world, 16 are in China. Meanwhile, in religious terms, there's a growing sense of Armageddon and the end of the world. It's been picked up by Hollywood movies. At any one time, there's at least one Hollywood movie dealing with the end of the world. So the Christians are waiting for the second coming, the Jews are expecting the Messiah, and the Shia are expecting the 12th Imam. And the Mayan calendar cuts out on December the 12th, 2012. When the Messiah does arrive, we'll ask him, is this your first visit, your second, or your 12th? So there's this sense of Armageddon. Meanwhile, of course, most people are being entertained to death and being diverted from this big picture, but via celebrity gossip and sport. So instead of talking about the end of the world, we'd much rather talk about the end of Paris Hilton. So what are the implications? Well, Australia has few immediate resource issues. It is clean and green, and it enjoys good social cohesion. We lack the culture of violence that you see in the United States. We reserve our anger for referees on a Saturday, not for politicians. So Australia may have time to adapt to the new era of resource scarcity. My final scenario is what I call breakthrough. So what we see with the breakthrough scenario is the value of crises as a turning point for change. You can do things in a crisis which you dare not do during ordinary times. So the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II, enabled President Franklin Roosevelt to reinvent the presidency and the notion of US government. Prior to that time, American presidents presided. That's why the term president was selected. George Washington, the first president, said that he wanted to preside over the United States. The real driving force for change has got to come from the House of Representatives, since all of the House is up for election every 2 years. They're closer to the people. They will live by the consequences of the policies they want to introduce. But by the 1930s and then the onset of World War II, things were so bad and the politicians were so dysfunctional that Roosevelt had to reinvent the nature of the modern American presidency. And of course, what we see in those years is a tremendous rebirth within the United States. For example, the men were recruited to fight in the wars, and so there were no men to work in the factories, or very few men. And so Kaiser, the biggest shipbuilding company in the world, decided to recruit women. Now, women were at home looking after the babies. So Kaiser said, not to worry, we'll become the biggest childcare provider in the world. And so the Kaiser shipbuilding factory, they built the ships and they also provided childcare, innovative ways of childcare. So in other words, this is how you can use a crisis. In World War II, there was a series of posters that were displayed saying, because petrol was rationed in the United States, you were not supposed to drive on your own. So there was a poster saying, if you are driving alone, you are driving with Hitler. So you can do this thing in a crisis. The tragedy is that following 9/11 in the United States, President Bush decided simply to go for the politics of fear and replay the fears back to the Americans, rather than providing the leadership that President Roosevelt was able to do in World War II. We could have used 9/11 to make it unpatriotic to be driving gas-guzzling vehicles. And instead, we could have decided to reinvent the American economy. We could have used it to get the Americans off their addiction to oil and develop alternative energy sources. My own feeling is perhaps, trying to be optimistic, the economic crisis could be used to generate a sense of urgency about the environment. In other words, we use the crisis to reinvent the economy. So in other words, we could create more jobs in the solar electricity industry. We can develop green-collar jobs, making homes more energy efficient, eliminating heat loss. Keep Peter Garrett away from that. We could have organic gardening on deserted city lots, good for growing of food, enhancing social cohesion, and giving people exercise. And we could even follow the example of Mrs. Roosevelt in World War II by growing vegetables on the south lawn of the White House. And I'm pleased to report that Mrs. Obama is doing just that. For the first time since World War II, we've got vegetables being grown on the south lawn of the White House. That's leadership. I only wish we could have more leadership from the political figures in the United States. So following on then this scenario that we can use the crisis to start working to preserve the environment and to invent a new type of green economy. For example, we've got the information technology revolution. Remember I talked about Moore's law, the doubling power of computers. Just as the planet is facing its greatest environmental crisis, with humans as the global cancer, remember a cancer destroys the body in which it grows.